Greetings. Good evening. Welcome to the gutter. Everyone ends up here eventually. It is only a matter of time. Each episode of the gutter is intended to explore the more forgotten aspects of the things that inspire. What started off almost exclusively as a dive into the history of comics and the artists that created them has evolved, as these things, I suppose, often do, into what inspires the guests from a broad range of topics. From Kursova delving deeply into the history behind the concept of the strongman that led to Machiste, Doc Savage, and eventually Superman himself, to Brian of Eris Saga discussing the impact of watching the never-ending story as a child and how that resonated with him into the creation process, to even last week with Steve Worcester discussing the impact of Al Williams' art in Star Wars. Each instance has been, in many ways, a deep dive into secondary topics all their own. In short, the entire thing went off the rails much quicker than I anticipated. So remember, in the immortal and eternally quotable words of Buckaroo Banzai, wherever you go, there you are. So here you are, and then, of course, there is tonight's episode. Brevity has never been a strength of mine, and on that I apologize. So, before we get into anything regarding the rather strange topic that we have tonight, let us greet those glorious gutterites and gutterines that have joined us in the chat this evening, those brave souls that have ventured beyond the fine, safe walls of other YouTube content to drift down, slum it for a bit here in the gutter. We've got Corey Barton, finally made it, not only on time, but before the show even started. Congratulations, Corey. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us. We've got Mad Ruth, one of the Friday nights over there on his show. They just had me on tonight as a guest. I really appreciated that. Thank you so much, sir. Thanks for coming in. Odin Dasco, good evening. Aldous in chat. Good evening yourself, Odin. Great to see you. Jay from Desolate Soul Studios with the long yo and a what's up, everybody. Great to see you as well. Dean! We always love to see Dean in the chat here in the gutter. Woo! We love you, JP. Raiden, you're getting some love from the chat, my friend.
Nice.
Crazy Mad's in the chat. Yo, chat, what's going on? Crazy Mad. Ice Queen's in the chat. Hey, y'all. Hey, y'all yourself. Thanks for joining us. So getting a little bit back on track. Like I said, tonight's episode of The Gutter is something special. And in fact, it is a first. It is either going to be the stuff of absolute legend or derided as a terrible choice that will fall into the annals of history alongside the Second Russian Pacific Fleet, Pickett's Charge, and Rob Liefeld's Ever Drawing a Comic Book. Yes, it could actually be that ugly. Tonight, we will be talking story. And not just any story, but the kind of story that just isn't told that often anymore. That of the long-form, multi-generational tale. American Pop by Ralph Bakshi did this, intermixing the harmonious tones of chords to the passage of time and the torches that fathers hand to their sons. Hymns of lessons and wisdom passed from one another on down the line. Through both time and blood, the story is both similar and yet altogether different from that. Tonight, we'll be discussing the evolving and ever-developing story around a New Jersey family in the post-World War II era. The story is told in a format that has arguably not been done well, or for that matter, tried often, as it consists of a Massachusetts band screaming at the absolute highest volume they possibly can into a microphone for the most part. I am, of course, referring to the band Defeater, and 3 of their albums in particular: Travels, Empty Days and Sleepless Nights, and Letters Home. I say we for what will become a semi-regular, if not regular, fixture on this show with my co-host, not guest, mind you, this evening. He is known by many names, and I can think of many I'd like to refer to him as, given the topic of choice tonight, but I mainly distinctly reference him as to RaidenRadio or JP. And when I'm delving into the depths of a story such as this, I can think of no other crafter or wordsmith I'd prefer to be sharing the stage with than him. So with that being said, JP, thank you so much for joining me this evening and providing this particular topic. I'm blown away by the depth of what these guys have done here.
I want to say thank you and welcome to my world. I have, as much as we all appreciate your knowledge, I have watched you on streams see somebody pull a comic out of a long box and say, oh, so and so penciled that, and he joined the run in 1977. We're stepping into my world. This is so welcome to being on the other side, the shoe being on the other foot, as it were, because we're going to be talking about, something that I can start pulling out names and record labels and who did what and all that. So thank you for the opportunity. And again, welcome to my world.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to this, man. And I think at the super high level, we're going to be talking storytelling, or at least that's going to be the undercurrent of a lot of what we're going to be talking about, or crafting, depending on how you want to phrase it, because it is indeed this particular parlance. It's a trade, no different than slinging ink or framing a house, or even laying bricks on a wall. I mean, it's I think the difference is, whereas with most trades, practice refines the product. When it comes to story crafting, practice certainly helps. But much like being that high tier level artist, there's an innate ability and understanding that must be present, and it's not something where you can just repeat words like structure and pacing in hollow and vacant rote tones like a parrot asking for a cracker. That does not the writer make. And this band, man, they've definitely got that innate ability in what they've managed to pull together here. So why don't you, I guess, to start off with, how did you ever discover this? Because I mean, I consider myself fairly well listened. I've never even heard of this band.
Yeah, I mean, we're off to a good start. Corey says never heard of him, and that kind of typifies all of this. But to really tell the story of how I found them, I need to take you back to way back in time to the 2000 aughts, like 2008, 2009. I was working at I was managing a record store, and then this was the time right after that. But what really got the ball rolling was the invention of something called Record Store Day, which is still around. It happens twice a year. It's basically a commercial holiday to get people, to buy music. And what it ended up spawning is what people know as the vinyl resurgence, right? People got back into records again. Now, most of this was done for a commercial ends, as many things are, where, they would basically repress, a Bowie album or a Prince record or a Nirvana record that you could probably get for about $10. They would repress it and sell it for like $40, and they would do that multiple times a year. But on the other side of that equation, there were a lot of companies that were starting to they saw people were interested in vinyl again, so they started scrambling to basically press anything that they could get the rights to. And so it was this kind of mad scramble to just, see what's out there and what could be put onto a lathe disc, to put a record out. One of the companies that did that, or I think did it better than most, was a company called Top Shelf Records. And they were basically just nabbing, rights to like really obscure Japanese rock bands. I would order like everything that they put out, so I was finding all of this stuff that I never would have, come across before, like, jam bands from Ireland called that only put out one album and then broke up. But I would snatch up that record because it was, kind of the thing to do at the time. And they picked up the rights to Defeater, or Defeater's first album, Travels, which was put out by Bridge 9 Records, but Top Shelf had picked up, the record printing rights, because that's the thing that you could do. So I just kind of was grabbing like pretty much whatever Top Shelf was putting out there, because it was new. It was, stuff I'd never heard before, even though I was, working in a record store for like half a decade. And I just kind of came across this band, and I don't remember exactly where it was, but right as I was starting to getting into studying literature is when I kind of pieced together through some internet posts that this band was putting out like an actual, like a novel, um, but they were telling these stories with each album signifying a different character. I just thought that was really, kind of strange. Um, Empty Days and Sleepless Nights comes out, and I think for me that's like their magnum opus, um, about the older brother in the family. Um, I went to see them live, and this was right around the time that I had started going back to school. I met, the singer, and we're talking, you know, modernist literature and Faulkner and all that. And I was like, wow, this had so much depth that, yeah, it just, that was pretty much the story of how I got into them. And then, of course, when I went back to school and I was studying literature, I was, reading these lyrics and looking at it as like a serious piece of literature. I think I wrote about them at one point. And so when I went on to make Eudaimonia, right, and people are asking me like, what are your influences? That's kind of a hard thing to really talk about because, you go on a stream, I can't really say, oh, it's this hardcore band from Boston that you've never heard of. Like that doesn't really provide a very good frame of reference, but um, it's something that I hope in your exploration you were able to see, like where I maybe farmed the idea of being inventive in storytelling and trying to create something, or not create something new, but tell a story in a very obtuse, weird way.
Right. Well, I think that's the most interesting aspect of this. And again, we're only going to be going over the first three albums. That's Travels from 2008, Empty Days and Sleepless Nights from 2011, and Letters Home from 2013. And as you said, the broad scope is they tell the story of a family post World War II. The father comes home after the war. There's two sons, and it's their interactions. And the first album, Travels, which we're going to touch on first, deals with the younger of the two brothers. And by pretty much the start of the album, the father's already kind of devolved into alcoholism, and that's the other interesting thing is the story is not chronological. If you use Travels as your baseline, all the other albums interface with it at certain points. So if you were to listen to it completely chronologically, you would actually listen to Letters Home first, and then get to a certain point, and then listen to parts of Travels, and then jump out and listen to parts of Empty Days, Sleepless Nights. But each album is told from one particular perspective. Again, Travels, the first album, from the younger brother. As you said, Empty Days and Sleepless Nights from the older brother, and then Letters Home are actually the letters home for the most part. There's songs of the letters that the father is sending home to his wife. And I have to say, like, while the story is impressive in both scope, adaptation, and execution, it is by far incredibly depressing.
Yes. I mean, I've heard you talk before about, and, feel free to correct me if I'm misinterpreting your words, but I've heard you talk before about comics being stuck in a state of deconstruction. Um, from talking with the lead singer, what I kind of gleaned out of him was that he was really trying to harken back to the modernists. So the modernists, for those that don't know, were essentially do what they were trying to do in their writing was basically deconstruct the American family. So that's one kind of way. I think they kind of transpose onto each other neatly, because if you think of the tired comics deconstruction of being like, you know, what if superheroes were actually a-holes, or what I mean, like that's pretty much what the modernists were doing, but with the American family. Like, what if it's like an American family but bad? And that, so now I'm kind of knocking, the thing that I'm here to, kind of dive into and celebrate. But that is pretty much the vantage point that they're coming from, is that modernist view of the American family, basically trying to tear down the idea of it being idyllic.
Right. Well, and I think with this in particular, I mean, let's just start off with Travels. So it's the younger brother's perspective. His father at this point he's an alcoholic. He's abusive. He's a veteran, obviously, as mentioned, but his relationship with his older brother is very distant. The younger brother fears the father. The older brother admires the father, looks up to him. The mother is presented as an addict and distant, almost like she just gave up at life and just is coasting. Um, basically the younger brother. This is the story of the younger brother coming of age, without any real connection to anybody in his family, in his own family environment. I'm not going to say he's not wanted, but that impression certainly came across for me. And I don't. Do we want to get? Do you want to kind of touch on some of the violence that happens in this, or?
Well, yeah, but real quick, like what you said is all correct. One of the really important things though is that, and again, it takes like the further, the later albums and more context, but you see in the second album that the older brother has a very deep affection and connection to the father. The younger brother has that same affection for the mother, but like you said, she's an addict. So the only connection that he has in the world is decaying and deteriorating before his eyes. So you're right in that he doesn't really have a connection to anybody, but it's because it's disappearing. It's vanishing in front of him.
Greetings, Jasper. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us tonight. But yeah, so the culmination event of violence here, like you said, is the younger brother has this affection, towards the mother. The father attacks the mother. The younger son defends her, and in the process of defending her, kills his father.
Correct.
And then runs away.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of finds a connection with as he's being a drifter, finds a connection with just another random soul who's another drifter. And that resonates with him. And he returns home.
Correct. You're talking about the prophet in plain clothes?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
So it's he almost has. Now, I'm not going to say it's a religious moment, but there does seem to be some major catharsis that occurs there. It and he's returning home to the unknown. How's his brother going to respond to him? Because of course, his father. He knows his older brother looks up to his father. His father's dead at his own hand, and so he's returning to the embrace of the unknown. He doesn't know what the status of his mother is. He doesn't know what the status of his relationship with his older brother is, and that's kind of where the album leaves off. Other than it's, I'm sorry, it is suggested at the end of the album that his mother, when he arrives home, his mother is dead, and his brother's distant, and it's evident, or at least highly suggested, from what my takeaway was, that there's no chance at redemption.
Yeah. And I mean, it's fascinating to think about, like what we were talking about before, about him having no connection at home, and that resulting in him just going along and drifting and finding that, there really is no connection anywhere. Like it's not that the world is faulty. It's that he's learning that the fault is within him, and that
Right.
he's not
Yep.
going to find that connection anywhere. So he may as well go back home.
No, and that's a good point, because I do think that last probably third, maybe last quarter of the album, it does seem to change from an exterior viewpoint to an interior viewpoint. He starts looking inside himself a little bit and becomes a little more introspective. What I found interesting was that there's almost a sense of passivity from the younger brother, despite the fact that he, in the course of the story, we'll get into that a little bit, but he's a passive voice and a passive character within his own story. Whereas when you get into Empty Days and Sleepless Nights with the older brother, he seems more engaged and active, fueled by a simmering rage.
Yeah, the tone, not to jump ahead, but yeah, like there are so many things that are fascinating about the use of tone, particularly in, yeah, like throughout these first three albums, the way, like, what person they're speaking in, you know what I mean? Like it gets to be really, really interesting. Like you can kind of dive into it and really think about it in terms of a metatextual form.
So I guess, when you're, as a standalone story, what do you feel that does this album complete a story? Does it have a beginning, a middle, and the end for the younger brother? Does it complete that, or do you feel it really needs to have the other two albums to enhance it?
No, I think the first album is really raw in about every way you can
Hmm.
imagine. Like you'll see in Empty Days and Sleepless Nights that there are ebbs and flows, and everything is done much better in the second album than the first. Um I think even the first story is a little bit on the melodramatic side. Um the ending of the story where he basically throws himself off the church is a little bit dramatic for me. Um, but I think it's one of those things where it's like with any band, you know what I mean? Like, not many bands put out their best album first. I think it's something that they were really working out the kinks on this one.
Gotcha. So it's if if Travels is the younger brother's introspection, then how would you describe Empty Days and Sleepless Nights? What this is the older brother's story. What's your general takeaway and tone from this?
I think that there is one of the most tragic ironies in this tragic story is that, you know, the second album is the story of what is easily the most pathetic character in the story, and yet he is the focal point of the entire narrative. And
Hmm.
I think it's also the most well done story. I think it has the best music on it. So there's like a certain irony to that that I think this is a masterpiece of an album, um, with the most kind of pathetic main character, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does for sure. So earlier I talked a little bit about the story is not told chronologically. And this album actually starts off from the older brother's perspective after the track Forgiver Forgetter from Travels.
Hmm.
And so the events of this album are occurring at the same time from the older brother's perspective as the rest of the album of Travels for the younger brother's perspective, which is brilliant. And it gets even better later with the last album we'll be talking about tonight, Letters Home. But so the father's killed by the younger brother, and it tells the older brother's story until the younger brother's return in debts on this album. Um, I mean, in general, that full range, it's struggle, it's pain. He's forced into a role because of his father's death of supporting his addicted mother. He's, I would almost say, it's a strange case. I can't really draw a parallel of another character I've seen has been done this way or this well. He's consumed at the same time by both the idolization of his deceased father and I'm not going to say hatred, but there's rage towards his younger brother for the removal of the idol. It's a strange dichotomy that exists in those few songs. Did you pick up on that, or is that am I drifting away from the context? Do you think here?
No, no, no. I mean, you nailed it pretty good. I think one of the most interesting, like you talked about the very beginning of the album, um, and the kind of weird relationship he has with both his father as a mythic figure and his brother as the mythic villain. The part that really gets me is the very first line he says, "Dear God, what have you done?" And then for the rest of the album, he refers to himself as you. So everything that he says about the little brother, you can kind of think of it as him also talking about himself, because he refers to the little brother as the coward, which is ironic because, he's clearly not a coward. He's the, he beat their dad to death and then ran off to go, do whatever. So coward doesn't really apply to him. But then later in the album, he refers to himself as a coward, and it just causes you to think back. And now everything is in flux. Who is he even talking about when he's talking about, when he's referring to the little brother? Is he really referring to himself?
Okay. Little,
Did I lose you?
yeah, you kind of lost me with that one. I'm not gonna lie.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Yeah, you lost me on that one. But so as this album progresses, the the desperation, and there seems to be a quiet desperation about the older brother because he essentially he seems to just be going through the motions, almost following in his father's footsteps, his idol, who's no longer there. He enters into a marriage, but the cycle immediately begins to repeat itself through alcoholism and abuse, which causes strain. And then he does something. He takes on the mantle of his father's responsibilities to the point that he takes on his debts.
Right.
And he gets into an altercation with his dad's bookie and gets his ass beat.
And they kill his wife.
And yeah, and he awakens, he comes home, and he finds his wife is dead. And so his mother's dead, his wife's dead, his brother's gone, his brother who killed his father's gone, and he just kind of sits there, and it's like he's on a low simmer,
Mm.
waiting for the day his brother comes back. And that's his story. And to your earlier point, there's no depth of character. There isn't. It's rage. He is an avatar of rage throughout this whole thing that seems to be the undercut of fuel. There's no joy in this entire album. It's despondent despair at every level. But yet it's incredibly engaging,
Yeah.
despite the fact that
Because
it's this dark journey.
even when you have, a soft acoustic song about how much he loves his wife, and by the way, that song I'm referring to, I Don't Mind, that was my wife and I, that was our first dance. That was our wedding song. So even a song that is that, cheery and hopeful, is completely undercut because you already know where this is going to go. You've already heard how that story ends.
So now there were a couple of selections here on lyrics that you wanted to kind of review and talk about for this album. Did you want to start with the first one, or was there anyone in particular?
No, that's fine.
All right. So, dear God, what have you done? Those words ring loud in the back of your head. That bottle lies in a thick blood red. I ain't no forgiver, forgetter. I ain't no forgiver, forgetter. Our mother waits in vain for a God that never loved us. As much as she prayed, he never showed up. Now, what was it about these in particular that you wanted to highlight?
Well, I mean, first there's the transition into the speaker referring to himself in the second person. Um, it's not something that you see. The first album is told entirely in first person. Um, the third, so it's not something you see again. But I it's really setting up a lot of things later on. And it really it plays around with that, with the use of speaker really well. um I think because you said that, like, the younger brother kills the father in the song, forgiver forgetter. So the use of voice here when he's saying I ain't no forgiver forgetter is really interesting. Like, who, is that something he's saying? Because again, like, throughout the album, he's only referring to himself as you. So there's just a lot going on here, and it all gets kind of set up with that very first line, "Dear God, what have you done?" There's also the question of, like, does he mean dear God in the terms, in like the way we would, you know, exclaim, like, dear God, or is he
Right.
actually talking to God, like, dear God, what have you done?
I never got that impression. I never got any religiosity out of
Yeah,
this. I thought it was more just an exclamatory statement as he's going through it. The I ain't no forgiver, forgetter. I found it interesting that I ain't no forgiver, forgetter.
right.
I took the comma as having inflection, as meaning that the forgetter is the younger brother,
Mm,
that he was speaking to him because I am not a forgiver, forgetter. I feel he's directing it outwards. And at least that's the tone I got. Like I said, I only had a chance to listen to these a little bit. I don't have the years of expertise on them that you do. Now, this next one that you selected, I found this amazing. And when I talk about the storytelling that is encapsulated across this, it's not just how the individual pieces of the albums interconnect with each of the individual characters that they're based on story. It's also the phrasing. And so,
Mm.
like this verse, the war-torn stories that he told you, you've got a hell of a lot to live up to. An airborne man with a scar and a wound, never make a promise that you can't prove. Going back, the war-torn stories that he told you, this is the older brother not understanding the younger brother's how he can't have a relationship with his dad.
Mm.
How did he not idolize him? You know, you've got a hell of a lot to live up to. This man was a hero. He was a great man. He was an
Yeah.
airborne man with a scar and a wound. You know, don't make a promise you can't. It's such again. There's that undercurrent of rage, and the hostility never goes away. And there's no semblance of forgiveness. There's no semblance of forgetting, like we talked about, forgiveness, forget, or it's just ever present. And then that bridge of dear father, it really hammers home that the idolization and worship that he had. And I think that's the most intriguing aspect of this, because the next the next album certainly doesn't present the father in any kind of a positive light that this seems justified.
Yeah, no, but I mean, at the same time, I think anybody can identify with it, because we don't see our fathers for who they are. We see them as the stories they tell, and um, they are that mythic figure, I think, to a lot of men.
Oh, I think so too. And I mean, everybody hits that age, and whether it was 17, 18, or whether it was later in your 20s, you always go through that rebellion of disagreeing with your father. It's when does that moment hit you that you realize that the old man was right? Does it happen in your mid to late 20s? Does it happen in your 30s? Or God forbid, does it happen after they're gone?
Yeah.
And I thought kind of there was an interesting corollary there that the band is certainly playing with in the lyrics. But as you move on too, we hit this one: and climb those cemetery walls again. Leave these flowers at your headstone. Climb those cemetery walls again. Every night, can't stand the sight of yourself. The self-loathing that is
Mm.
in this album is, I didn't quite get that. Do you take that as the older brother holds himself accountable for the younger brother's actions?
I think if you go back one to the previous one,
Yeah.
I think the line that's really telling to me is, and you are your father's son. Meaning, I think that, the way he views his father, it's almost as if he uses the fact that he's his son as like a crutch. Meaning, like, when all else has failed, he sees him as, like, it's something to live up to, and he knows that he's failed at that. But at the same time, at least he can say, like, well, I'm my father's son, so I still have that, or at least like a small nugget of that, a crumb to kind of hold on to. So he's just telling himself, be the man he made you to be, even though he knows damn well he is nowhere near that.
So when we're going through these, right, we have Travels, which is all about the younger son, and though it's raw, it does seem to have the most well-rounded character of the three. The younger brother seems to, you understand motivations, you understand his experience, and you understand why he's done what he's done. He's incapable of accepting responsibility because he's this, not meek, but he's certainly not prepared for the world. And then once he goes out and experiences the world, he becomes that, instead of extrospective, he becomes that introspective person and realizes he's got to go home to close the loop.
Hmm.
The older brother in this case like you said, is definitely the shallowest of the characters developed.
Yeah.
But he, like you just alluded to, he's using the shadow of the father to, that's his foundation. His father is his foundation. So when we move into the next album and we move into Letters Home, you're learning about the father, but it's still in my opinion, it's referential. It's defining the older brother by talking about the father, because he is the father. He's trying to carry that mantle forward, both in physical sense by collecting his debts and working to support his addict mother until she passes away, but also in the sense of he's trying to become the man that he viewed his father as. He's trying to maintain that ideal that he can never climb.
Yeah. And I mean, another thing to kind of like dump onto the tragedy of the older brother, you can look at it from the perspective that the younger brother was really defending their mother, so imagine you're an older brother watching your little brother stick up for your mother. Like, you wouldn't do that. You couldn't do that. So obviously it's a very complicated situation, but I would argue that the younger brother is the more heroic of the two. Not that either of them are heroes, but I would say the older brother is considerably lower than the younger brother.
Right. Well, I think he's almost a foil,
Yeah.
in the sense between the two, the father and the younger brother. He's serving as that metric. He's serving as that fulcrum point that they can rotate around, and it's really interesting how it's encapsulated. And going back to this next one, where he's climbing those cemetery walls again every night, can't stand the sight of yourself. I think that harkens back to what you're saying, is that there's a sense of self-loathing for sure, and that
Mm.
is ever present across all of these albums. Again, this is an incredibly depressing story that they've woven, but you've got characters that hate themselves at a fundamental level. Every night can't stand the sight of yourself. He can't stand what he's had to live with, and it's not because of his wife being murdered. It's not because of his father being murdered. It's simply, I think, like you said, he's been he's been a passive actor in his own life. He hasn't acted,
Mm.
and he's
Yeah.
floating. He has no definition other than that which he defines himself through his father. He's not self-definition, it's cross-referential definition. And then you see that a little bit again here of, hello, my dear, it's so nice to see you here. How long has it been? Oh, it feels like years, but I'm sure it's just been days. And then I'll never feel the same or ask another girl to take my name. It it seems almost dismissive to me based off the previous tone.
Mm. You mean like he doesn't actually like he sees her as like a vessel for fulfilling that fatherly role?
Yeah, he was just going through the motions. He was just
Yeah, one of
he
the
was
earlier
following.
songs, yeah. One of the earlier songs where they meet, I agree, it kind of sounds that way. It was like, "Yeah, I bought you a drink and yep, that was it."
Right. It's fulfilling the obligation. It's for no other reason other than just, well, this is what dad did. At a very simple level. And a deeper level, I think there's a lot more contextual meaning. And then to hit the last one here, we've got, hello, my dear, it's so hard to see you here. How long has it been since we put you in the ground? Oh, it feels like days, but it's been years. Oh, please don't call me baby. It's just too hard to hear. Too hard to hear. Leave your followers at your headstone. Just sit and talk to you, my dear, my dear. See, and then the corollary here is now it's like when he needs something,
Yeah.
it suddenly becomes a more personal relationship. Everything is self-referential with the older brother in this album, and it's incredibly depressing. It's
Yeah.
it's I can't emphasize that enough.
Every time I hear that song or I'm reminded of it, I make sure to hold my wife extra close at night, you know?
Hmm. So then,
But yeah.
as we move into Letters Home, as I said,
Mm.
Letters Home is it tells the story of the patriarch of the family, the father, and the structure is. I know you commented that said you thought that Empty Days and Sleepless Nights was the second album, and the older brother was their best work. And I tend to disagree. I thought Letters Home was amazing because it's structured in an inverted chronological order.
Mm, yeah.
Each song is a letter written home while the father was in World War II. and it covers the father's life prior to the song "Blessed Burdens" in Travels, and it shows his. It's an inverted decline. They show you at his lowest point, and then they bring him up to his highest. So, following the older brother's idealization and showing all of his despondency, we now show you in reverse order. We end not at his low point, but we end at his highest.
I am so sorry. I wasn't ready. I thought I got to get caught back up again. Yeah. I mean, man, these guys know how to start an album. I think all three of these albums just hit you like a punch in the face. You know what I mean? Like you have Dear God, What Have You Done? And the album opens with Bastards, which has like a pretty obvious double meaning. I hope this finds you well. Like it just grabs onto you. So these guys definitely know how to make an entrance.
Right, for sure. And so, yeah, and as Ape says, glad to tune in. I needed to pick me up. Yeah. This isn't necessarily so much about the despondency or the depressing nature of the story. It's how they crafted it.
Yeah.
And it's showing that you can write something that is incredibly dark and incredibly deep and hits the most negative, blackest tones of human emotion and still make it extraordinarily captivating. While the vast majority of their music is certainly not something I would regularly listen to, I found myself listening to a couple of these songs over and over again because the lyrics are, number one, they're kind of hard to hear because they're screaming, but if you can get past some of that, there's a lot of depth here and I think where this really hits home is at the end of Letters Home. You learn that basically the father's entire motivation for why he was the way he was because his own brother died in the Pacific Theater.
Yeah. And
so
you get a little bit of that you can kind of catch a glimpse of his older son, that kind of relationship with a brother. You know, in his case, he was overtaken by his younger brother, whereas the father was kind of outshined by his older brother.
No, for sure. And Ape makes a great point in that Cormac McCarthy is great at this, making the darkness beautiful. I would like to expand upon that a little bit. A few months back on Comic Talk, we did a 5 greatest villains. And one of the ones that JP suggested was the Judge from Blood Meridian. And I had started Blood Meridian a handful of times and always set it down and never finished it. I've since finished it. And I have to say, the Judge in that is the absolute devil. He is, that ending I was not prepared for.
Holy
that
crap.
Was just much, and anybody that's read Blood Meridian will understand what I'm talking about, but the same emotional impact that ending had, these albums had. It was the story that they tell of 3, arguably 4 broken people and their journey and their interrelationships is amazing. But how the story is paced, how it's intercut across these 3 albums was simply astounding. You don't see story, like I said in the intro, you don't see story crafting like this. And for it to be out of some screamo hard metal band out of Massachusetts was just, it came out of left field, man. This is the kind of stuff that these guys should be writing novels, not music, in my opinion. But
one of the things I really like about Travels is, and it's something you get a bit of a glimpse of in especially the second album, is you can tell that the author has a lot of genuine, and I can confirm it from talking to him, when I met him, but there is a very profound admiration for the military. I don't think it's done cheaply or, for any personal benefit, but the line he has a line where he says, now we're ragged and torn like the flags that we fly, like the ones we laid down on a coffin so clean, and see those eyes staring back, the boys we used to be. It really kind of brought me back to All Quiet on the Western Front,
Hmm.
and in really capturing the toll that the war takes. Which, and it's kind of astounding because it's written by some, All Quiet on the Western Front, written by somebody who actually served. This
Right.
guy did not serve, but he does seem to have that genuine admiration, as I said.
Right. Well, and it harkens back to that the classic baptism by firefight.
Yeah.
Um, there's only two kinds of people: those that have seen combat and those that haven't. If you've seen combat, you understand, and if you haven't, you haven't, and you'll never understand because it's a baptism by fire. You're a changed person, just like you're a changed person when you go through a traditional Christian baptism. But with the context of the whole story, as you step back and view it, do you see any? What's the lesson, I guess, that a writer can take away from something that's crafted in this way?
Mm. I think, I mean, apart from, it's hard to talk about it and not talk about form. Um, but
Well,
I think,
explain a little bit what you mean by form.
well, I mean, you know, it takes a serious commitment to decide that your musical career is going to be dedicated to telling one story. You can say it's more complex than that, or we're looking at it from different characters on different albums, but they don't make albums that aren't about this story. So that's a pretty unique and special thing to pretty much to dedicate what's going to be your entire musical, like your entire career as an artist, to just telling this one story in a way that no other musician is going to do. Nefarious in the chat, he brings up a good point. Coheed and Cambria, again, another band of this time. They did not only do they do the same thing, and not only are they way more successful than Defeater is, but they actually have a line of comic books and graphic novels that are like companion pieces. Um,
Okay.
that's more of a sci-fi thing, though. This is hard-boiled modernist American literature. Um, Telling depressing as hell stories or a story about a family. But as somebody, and as Arrogant Ape said there, like, I think what you take away from this is that, you know, you can extract beauty from darkness. If you're doing darkness for darkness sake, I think that's a little bit different from what we're seeing here. I think we're seeing like a really in-depth character study. And I think that kind of justifies the wallowing in darkness that we end up doing here.
No, and I think you're right. There definitely is the sense of the depraved for the sense of the depraved. That's only grown in the last, well, in the modernist movement, in the last 50 years. But I think there's something that goes beyond that, and I think guys like Bukowski, in my opinion, is a guy
Mhm.
that's really kind of hearkened in on that. When you get to the personal side of that depravity and that darkness, and you're really delving into depression of whatever level, you can do it really well if you understand it, if you've been there.
Mm.
And the cold grip of depression touches everybody at some point in their life. Everybody's had a down day, and there's no shame in admitting that. But something like this, you know, I've talked a lot about younger writers and people that are in their early 20s that are writing, and I've never understood why. Um, Go out and live, because you need to experience like the bargain, the absolute bottom of the barrel of pain. You need to experience euphoria. You need to have a complete understanding of what the gauge level of that emotional spectrum actually is. And unless you've had your heart ripped out and thrown down in front of you and stomped on, or you've really truly experienced absolute joy, it I don't see how you can write that. And somebody in their early 20s, just I don't see how you can have the foundational life experience to gauge those things, nor the emotional or mental maturity to deal with them in the context of a story. That's not to be saying that there aren't good writers. I don't understand how somebody in their 20s can be at that point. And as I appreciate the greetings to Era, thank you for joining us. But also, Neff agrees with me, so I'm right, bitches. I appreciate all this position on this. Young people need to go, need to shut up and go live before they
Well, I
try to
mean,
write.
that's the fascinating, juxtaposition here is that, and feel free to disagree and roast me in the chat, but like my theory on bands from listening to tons and tons of music is that they tend to not get better over time. Meaning a band comes out and what they want to do is they want to set themselves apart. So they come out with a fire, right? They want to get noticed. They want to be different. So they come out and they just kick the door down and they kick ass. And it lasts like maybe 1 or 2 albums, maybe 3. But then what ends up happening is they decide that they want to be great. And when they want to be great and they try to be great, what that translates to into, especially in metal bands, you see this a lot, is you have metal bands that are like, I want to be Iron Maiden. I want to be Judas Priest. I want to be Led Zeppelin. So that you lose the fire and you get musicians that are just rehashing the same old crap. So
I definitely
your
agree
point
with you.
about an old soul, like how does an old soul, come out with that fire if you're a musician wanting to tell a story?
Well, I think if you look at, and granted,
Oh, sorry, I got to interrupt you. Aerith said Coheed. There are a few that get better over time. Coheed is one of them. That is 100% correct. They are one of very few bands that have continued that fire. And you could say that the irony is that, or you could say the reason why is because they're telling a story. So they're devoted to that fire. It has to stay with them.
Right. Well, I look at, I mean, when you're talking, especially when you're talking about bands that tell a story. I mean, obviously, concept albums are not a new thing. Obviously, you've got Tommy by The Who, you've got Quadrophenia by The Who. Of course, those are both standalone stories. They're not the overarching cross albums that these are. The concept album that is a personal favorite of mine, it still gets a lot of replay for me, was Queensryche's Operation Mindcrime. And to your point, I don't think they've ever hit any tone since they did that. It was like that was what they were building up to, and everything after that was like, well, what do we do now? They seemed lost for a long time. Even today, they've released Operation Mindcrime 2, like 15 years ago. It wasn't nearly the same. Once they seemed to hit that emotional high, they seemed to lose it. With these 3 albums, I tend to agree with you that I think 2 is probably their most structurally sound, but I think 3 was their best. Letters Home, I was really moved by that. I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah, from here, the story, I'm not going to lie, the story, it becomes too jumbled. The 4th album introduces a new character, and I could see the twist coming. Literally, the moment I knew who the character was, I knew exactly what was going to happen to the story. So it's like The Simpsons. You have to just pretend that they don't exist.
So if we take a giant step back and we look across these 3 albums, the key word for understanding this euphonious narrative that we've been discussing is to listen. And listen for you has, and this is a pretty bad segue, but listen for you has a little bit of a different context, because right now you've got an ash can up on Fund My Comic called Listen. That's a preview of your next Noirlam novel. How much of something like Defeater's storytelling style plays into your writing for something like Noirlam?
For Noirlam, I would say that this definitely fed into my desire to go back in time a little bit. I couldn't tell you exactly why I feel much more comfortable in decades I never lived in. but there's definitely that. There's the the way Defeater talks about those old steel tracks and those little details that really make you feel like you're in another time and place. That was something that definitely, rubbed off on me. Having a bunch of characters smoke cigarettes, that's absolutely one. But yeah, I mean, I would say that definitely the wanting to step back in time and kind of capture another era through the little details in the background.
Gotcha. So before we close it out, I just want to kind of cover this again. We were talking tonight about Defeater. That's 3 albums in particular. Travels from 2008. The album art is right there. Empty Days and Sleepless Nights from 2011. And then what was arguably my personal favorite, not just due to the pack of Luckies that was on the album art, although I do have to admit a little bit of bonus points went to him for that. Letters Home from 2013. So all that being said, final word goes to you, my friend. What do you have to say?
So I have to talk about this. I think that the coolest detail about all of this, I started by talking about records, and Aldous already told you about this, but in the song on Empty Days and Sleepless Nights, Cemetery Walls, he talks about tracing the grooves on your headstone, meaning tracing the grooves to symbolize like the kind of like the sign that you are dead. At the end of the album, when the older brother gets hit by a train, the actual record cuts into silence, and the record gets locked into a special kind of groove that will keep the record spinning around and around on your turntable forever unless you turn it off. And so even on the pressing of their record, they managed to work in symbolism of death. And that just blows my mind.
That is impressive for sure. That being said, thank you for joining us tonight on this rather dark and introspective journey across the music of Defeater. I do highly recommend you check these albums out. The story alone is worth your listen, even if the music may not be. With that being said, I am Aldous. This is JP. We hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us in the gutter.
This is blood for blood and by the gallons. This is the old days, man, the bad days, the all or nothing days. They're back. There's no choices left.
still here? It's over. Go home. Go.